All right, so let's start talking about the third theory, and this is again the third modern theory. So we talked about reflexive, we've talked about hierarchical, we talked about our first modern theory of motor programming, and then we talked about our second modern theory, which would be systems, and this is our third modern theory, neuronal group selection. And I've provided for you guys a reading. It's by Suzanne Campbell from 2000 out of what used to be the Neurological Physical Therapy Journal, used to be called Neurology Report, and so it's out of Neurology Report in 2000. I definitely recommend you guys read this article. It is a little bit focused on pediatrics, but it is a great reference, and it's not very long, on neuronal Darwinism. Edelman's neuronal Darwinism, or neuronal group selection, has three basic tenets. The first tenet is brain development. And this is actually related to the genetic coding that we have, the specificity of some neurons to perform some function. And even though we have all these, there is neurons do compete to make connections, and so and then diversity results from that. So even though we have this basic coding, there is this diversity that is present within everybody. The second tenet has to do with experience on brain development, and this actually has to do, and this is the formation of functional circuits. So as we're functioning, what happens is we start developing connections between motor or specific sensory receptors. So we start building these connections, and that's based on function. So those groups that receive input simultaneously, they become strongly interconnected, and the synapses become stronger. And when we get to tenet 3, this is actually the integration of multiple systems in a distributed whole. So we'd start developing maps which are connected over the whole sensory system, so that perception and cognition and emotion and movement are all interconnected, and those that are related to certain movements start having these stronger maps and relationships to each other. So based on these three basic tenets for neuronal Darwinism that we just talked about in the slide previous, that has clinical implications for what we're doing as physical therapists. So if we want to strengthen neuronal connections, what we need is repeated experience, and then that causes a permanent change with repetition in the efficiency of both the pre and the post synapses. Movement activates sensory receptors, and then that starts forming connections between multiple sensory systems that may be facilitated simultaneously, and starting to hook and form some of those perception. And then also those activations of those sensory receptors become important and actually start being related to the movement patterns that are used when those sensory receptors are activated. So we start getting these connections between sensory receptors, between sensory and motor receptors, and understanding and reading some of those internal and external demands or forces, so that we can produce successful movement. It also suggests that we have to be active, that active self-generated movement is essential to form those neuronal interconnections. If we're passively moved, then that isn't actually activating the part of the motor system that we need to start forming those connections. The third sort of the focus that it brings up, or idea that it brings up, is that a variety of functional movement synergies are needed or could be used to accomplish a task demand. So that once we have these interconnections formed, we can maybe pull together a few of these synergistic or highly connected neurons to complete and be successful at some functional activities. So again, repeated experience is necessary. We want to activate and start making connections between sensory receptors and other parts of the brain, including motor, potentially emotional connections as well. So I feel good when I do this activity. It's necessary that we activate those sensory receptors and connect it to the movement patterns, and that helps us to know what to pay attention to, what sensory receptors are going to be important as we're learning a movement, and or what's important for us to detect in the environment with our sensory systems as we do an activity, maybe to adjust that activity. It also suggests that we must be active and self-generating of movement. And then lastly, clinically, we must start looking at applying synergies to accomplish a task or demand, maybe multiple synergies, and make those synergies stronger to use for a variety of tasks. All right, so we're going to do, just like we have in the other lectures, we're going to pause here for a moment. I want you to pull out your table, and I want you to think about how does neuronal group selection contribute to what maybe is important to us when we're listening to somebody's history, how it affects the examination techniques we're going to use, how it modifies the evaluation or the thoughts that we're going to use as far as what might be impairing this person, our client, from improving the motor behavior, and then also what are we going to do for an intervention. So again, I want you to spend a few minutes writing down some thoughts, talk to your classmates, and listen to what they have, and get a good communication going, a good discussion going, and then when you're ready, come back and play, and we'll review some of these ideas. All right, so now that you've had a chance to think about how neuronal group selection will impact us as physical therapists in the clinic, let's talk through some ideas that I have. And again, these are not all inclusive, but maybe highlight some areas, and maybe you have something different. And if you do, I'd love to hear you share it. Maybe we can put together a time that we actually share these as a group. All right, so when we think about neuronal group selection and history, anything in the history that would indicate trauma or limitations in the development or functioning of areas of the brain would certainly be an issue. Limitations in sensory input and or motor output. So if we have an impairment in the development of neuronal connections, damage to areas of the brain, and in addition, even in our history, if we have limited rehearsal, you wouldn't expect there to be strong connections made at that point. So you may be thinking that you can improve connections if they don't have a lot of rehearsal. As far as our examination, we're again going to be looking at the task within the environment. We're going to be examining or really observing that behavioral output, the movement output, and we're going to be looking at those in light of coupling of sensory to motor. So what's the sensory input? Are they detecting it? And is that tied closely to a motor output? In addition, what we may be thinking about is an emotional or motivational response to the motor behavior, or the need to produce a motor behavior. And that could either, if we have a positive emotional response to it, we feel good about it, that would support rehearsal and additional practice, or negatively, if we have a negative emotional response, that could inhibit or impact negatively the motor behavior. As far as evaluation, we're going to view all motor behavior in terms of current connections and possibly missing connections. So what do we see that probably has a strong connection? They see a difference in something in the environment, and then that triggers a motor behavior response, which would suggest a strong connection between that sensory input and the motor response. Or maybe we don't see a change in behavior due to a change in environment or either vision or proprioception, and therefore the connection would be weaker, would be assumed to be weaker. As far as intervention, we want to strengthen connections through self-generated repetition. We're going to emphasize and potentially change up and modify sensory input and look for a strong and rapid connection to a motor response to changes or our emphasis on a sensory input. We're going to encourage that movement and strengthen it through repetition, and we may want to use different environments or change up the environment in some way and look for, again, that strong motor response. And we may want to actually strengthen those motor patterns and the connections between sensory and motor and even emotional connections by trying to facilitate that same movement in a variety of different tasks. All right, so I think that this sort of concludes our review of neuronal group selection. You're going to now look for the lecture on dynamic action theory, and then we will continue with dynamic action theory, and then we have one more theory, is ecological theory. So we're wrap it up here, and please look for the next lecture.